Can I get a motion to approve the agenda? Get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we can get right on to the action items. East Maple Avenue water relocation authorization of contingency increase by Sam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Wait for the presentation to get teed up here. So this morning, we're presenting a request for authorization of a contingency increase for the East Maple Avenue Water Main Relocation Project. This was a project that was designed to improve the system reliability by removing some deteriorated sections of pipe away from some residential areas, or rather the residences themselves. It was brought before the CIP committee back in February of 2023, approved by the board and awarded in March. Madigan Construction, who does a lot of linear work for us, won that bid and did the work for us. The revised substantial completion date after some VDOT related delays in coordination is actually tomorrow. So as we approach the end, several items have been accumulated on the change order side of things, and then one final one that was a VDOT request to extend the area of mill and overlay, sort of tipped us over the edge of contingency, and we're here to request around $11,000 to cover that work. We'll get a little bit into the details of what cost all this, how we got here. The first two items were related to design errors and omissions. These are both items which, had they been considered in the original design, we would have covered those costs in the original bid. But instead, they were sort of discovered as we went. And so they accumulated towards the overall overrun on our contingency for this project. So the first one here, the additional ARV vault depth, we basically set an ARV and it's a vault at a depth of 3.5 feet, and our design manual calls for 5, and it was basically that straightforward depth increase to meet our design standard from 3.5 to 5 feet. That necessitated a slightly larger vault, a little bit of additional excavation and material, and that's somewhere in the region of $4,000 of additional expenses there. The next one is additional cathodic protection provisions. We had some provisions specified in the contract, not all. There was a little bit of negotiation, and in the end, we determined that we needed an additional isolation flange kit and a test station for the system that we had specified. Because it was a negotiation, the contractor ultimately agreed to cover all labor costs, and we just covered the furnishing of materials. That worked out to be about $6,500, and we'll get into a breakdown after this slide so that you can see all in context of the overall. The third and fourth items were really unit price-based items in which we saw overruns. Pretty straightforward again. You anticipate some rock excavation at the time of design. In this case, we anticipated about 100 cubic yards and ended up needing 126 in the overall. So that resulted in a change of about $6,000 at the stipulated contract price, which I believe was like something like $225 per cubic yard. The last one, it really is what tipped us over the edge. So we coordinated with VDOT on what they wanted to do for a mill and overlay for restoration of the road that was impacted by construction. When we brought them back for a final inspection, they determined that they wanted some additional area. And it was so much more, in fact, that it resulted in a $20,000 add. I believe the original stipulation was for $1,450 square yards on as a unit price basis at $33 per square yard. Ultimately, they requested around 2,080 or so. So that resulted in a breakdown as follows, if I can get our friend here to cooperate. Nathan, can you maybe override me and? Thank you. So that's the overall breakdown. Our contingency for the project was around 26,387, was actually 26,387 when it was approved by the board back in March. Our ultimate change order total ended up being 37,384.37. And that's based on mainly based on the mill and overlay overrun here. 37,384.37. I apologize for the statement there. Oh, now it's working, Nathan. Got it back. So yeah, so ultimately resulted in about $11,000 in additional contingency that we need, and we are here before the committee to present the request for authorization and address any questions you might have.
I have a couple of questions. The additional VDOT requirement, what made this job different than the others? You don't normally run into this kind of a additional requirement. Why, what was it about this that caused it?
I'm actually a little timid about presenting our bullpen slides, but in this case, I was ready for the question, so I'll highlight it here. So basically, the originally coordinated area is back here in the black, and it's superimposed by the new red area. And it basically comes down to this point along the line here where we had a T and a valve. If you can see it, Mr. Sultan, I'm not sure it's very discernible from here, but there is a point in which the mill and overlay area sort of juts out and back in. And VDOT basically changed their minds when they visited the site earlier this week and requested that we do a more sort of geometrically, how do you say it? Yeah, rectangle. It's almost a rectangle, right? You have a little angled, but basically, yeah, more of a rectangular area than what we had anticipated. And so when you take that long additional area, that strip, it adds up.
In other words, we tried to anticipate to the best we could what the mill and overlay area would be, but it becomes very subjective on the field inspection at the conclusion of the work. And so we just didn't quite cover ourselves for that additional area.
So this reminds me when I worked in the district, we put in a pump station, it get all approved, we come in for final inspection and they make major changes to what they already approved. And when you try to complain to them, tough.
And we actually experienced some of this at the outset of the project as well. We had coordinated during design on some of the phasing, scheduling, sequencing, and so forth. And Sam, if I'm not mistaken, then after we awarded the contract, there were some miscommunications with VDOT amongst their internal folks and time of year for being able to open cut the road, having to do with placement of steel plates during periods when snow removal may be occurring and so forth. So this project has actually been a great one for strengthening our partnership with VDOT and coordination. And I think there have been some growth. There has been some growth in the partnership we have with the permitting office through this project.
Yeah, actually, Mr. Sultan, almost as a result of this project, we started having a meeting with VDOT. Staff is now having a meeting with VDOT every 2 months to go over projects, approvals, permits, and that sort of thing, and strengthen our coordination efforts and maybe, dare I say, our overall relationship to hopefully avoid some of these impacts and misunderstandings in the future.
I have one or two other
Yeah, I have
questions.
one question. So for the initial process, when you obtained the requirement from VDOT, did they provide something in writing, or is that something we anticipated and did some estimations to come up with the initial, just trying to understand the process?
I believe in the case that Alton was referencing earlier, where we had approval to do certain work at certain time of year with certain provisions to maintain a flow of traffic, and then Basically, they changed their minds. There was actually some correspondence.
Okay. So
We really tried to lean on that to get a better outcome, but circumstances ended up being that they just needed the project to move.
And in their defense, sometimes, they do take the brunt of public outcry for streets not having, geometric patchwork and in the case of the steel plates and the time of year, it is motorist safety that's paramount. So we try to anticipate everything on both sides of the table, but these are just some of the issues that we incur once we get underway with the work.
Sam, if I, could I ask a question?
Sure.
If I understand you correctly, the additional overlay this is what was anticipated, and to the red line is what VDOT wanted further out, but this was what was originally anticipated?
That's right.
Okay, so, thank you. No further questions. And is this a CIP committee item or is this a joint committee item?
Well, and I'll ask Jewel, but I think this is a CIP committee item, not joint.
This is the FBI.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will stand down.
Marty,
I don't know, how dare you ask a question?
I
Marty, I have a question unless, and you said it in your presentation, but you didn't in the slides. You used errors and omissions. Are we making an E&O claim against the designer for the errors and omissions?
So typically, we have provisions in our BOA contracts to cover that. Typically, that sort of kicks in when it's something which requires rework or an error which resulted in additional expenditures that we wouldn't have seen if the design error was sort of reconciled during the design phase. So that's sort of, I set that up earlier. We would have probably paid for this work anyway, had it all been incorporated into the design, but it wasn't. So in this case, we may, sort of use our better judgment and cover it.
And the other items that you describe are just betterments, not.
We set the contract line items up as unit price, so we assume the quantity in our bid form, and the contractors just go in and put in their unit price, and that contributes towards their overall bid price, right? So our assumptions were basically low in both cases by the amount shown on the slide here.
Okay, thank you.
What about the rock excavation? You said you underestimated the amount of rock.
Slightly. So we anticipated 100 cubic yards. We stipulated that in our bid form. We ended up with 126 in the end. You sort of base on a percentage of anticipated rock and assumption based on the overall length of your trench. In this case, it ended up being a little bit more than we anticipated or assumed.
To determine the rock surface?
I'm going to have to get back to you on the history of this particular project. Sometimes when we do anticipate problems and we want to be a little more informed, we do. But I can't quite recall whether we did or we didn't for this particular project. I'll have to defer to our project manager on that one.
In the positive part of this, I don't remember you guys ever in recent memory exceeding contingency that I could.
And, something to that point that I wanted to point out, some of these smaller projects that we're doing, relatively smaller total dollar value projects that are also R&R type work where you are more likely to run into certain challenges, within an existing street and so forth. We're typically applying a 5% contingency factor to these contracts, and that ends up creating a relatively small pool of contingency funds. So I really think that has factored into this project, and going forward, it's something staff may want to think about. And when we come forward with smaller projects, we may ask for 10% contingency.
We discussed that on phone the other day, that you guys would like to up the contingency that you have on these projects. So I don't remember what the percentage was, 7 or 8. And I think what I said is, I don't have a problem with that as long as you keep a record, which I think you do. Keep a record of how many times in the next period that you exceed the 5,
Right,
just so we see where we're at.
right.
Um,
And we'll keep
I don't know what
visibility
you
on,
think As far as approval for something like that,
right.
I don't know if the committee has to vote on it or whatever.
Well, on an individual basis, we'll present with the motion
But
what
just
we're
keep
asking
track
for.
on it.
And in the quarterly updates, we'll continue to track those metrics for the
Okay.
committee.
Are there any other questions? Even from those who aren't on the committee?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just say, other than VDOT, I mean, these are just little piddly things. This is stuff that comes up, and VDOT is what VDOT is. Those things happen too. People change their minds, people are unreasonable, they're a big agency, and so just seems like it's normal fare.
But like I said, in the district, we once had to reconstruct part of a pump station because they changed their mind on fire protection requirements after the fact and after they approved the plan. So this is small stuff compared to that kind of thing.
And they would grandfather that in?
We were screwed.
No.
All right, and any other questions? No? Somebody want to make a motion?
I
I'll-
would, but, I told not to.
I'll do it.
Do it.
I move the recommendation to the board to authorize an additional $11,000 in contingency to be controlled by the general manager for the construction of the East Maple Avenue Water Main Relocation Project. The revised total authorized budget for the project is $551,000. Additional costs will require board approval. And
I'll second that.
this goes through the board consent agenda.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, next one. Approval of the 2025 capital spending plan and review of 2025 to 2034 capital improvement plan by Darren Gelder and Tom Lipinski.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to the board members who are here and good morning to those who are online. I think there's a few there. Thanksgiving is coming soon, so it can only mean one thing. It's CIP season, right? That's usually a week before and certainly is true for this year. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction and then I'm going to turn the presentation over to Darren Gelder. Darren's our manager of planning and many of you may be familiar with Darren, and we will kind of get into the presentation. So I'll give you guys just a quick glance of what we're going to talk about today before I turn it over to Darren. I'm going to start off with the information that was provided to you all in board docs. There was the standard write-up and presentation. Then in addition to that, there is a PDF, one page of the 10-year CIP. It's a bar chart. And then also there was about I don't know, 6 or 7 page PDF document of the tabular listing of all of the individual projects that are in the 10-year CIP. So those are just provided for you guys, kind of high level if you want to kind of take a quick look through those. Before we kind of get going, let me talk about what we're going to see today. So you're going to get a presentation, but it's almost can be thought of like 2 separate presentations. The first part, the beginning of it, we're going to look at the capital spending plan for next year. So we're going to look at next year's budget, the 2025 capital spending plan. And I think I'm going to kind of explain, and Brian, you'll correct me if I say something wrong here, but and this kind of goes to Mr. Yudd's recent just comments about participation in this meeting. This is really, it's a CIP meeting. I think that when we get through the capital spending plan, that at the end of the whole entire presentation, not just, it'll be a pause, but we're going to go and review the capital spending plan with you. And then the CIP committee is going to be asked to take action on that 2025 capital spending plan. You'll be asked to move it forward to next month's board meeting. And therefore, the capital spending plan or that capital budget will become one of the 2 components of our overall budget for next year. It'll be brought together along with the operating budget, which I believe you guys probably already took care of at the Finance Committee meeting. And so we'll go through the 2025 capital spending plan, and then at the end of everything, you'll be asked to take action on that. Again, that'll just be for the CIP committee members. Then after the capital spending plan is reviewed, the second part of the presentation is really going to look at years sort of 2 through 10 of the 10-year CIP. And that really is just going to be an informational discussion. We're going to share with you guys what the forecast looks like. There's going to be some focus on the first 5 years because that is often tied into our financing plans and so forth. But that second part of the presentation is really just going to be informational, and there isn't going to be asked of any action at the end for years 2 through 10. So hopefully that's clear as turkey gravy. We do the 10-year lookout. It's a little bit, it's not common, but we do find that looking out through the 10 years as we get into that discussion is really beneficial to us at Loudon Water. It really helps us kind of organizationally and financially to better plan as those things are starting to move forward. But of course, the second 5 years, we don't have a crystal ball, so we're doing our best to try to forecast that. But the second year, certainly we don't have the exact same confidence as we might in the first 5 years. And certainly that confidence is higher as we talk about next year, what we think we need for next year in the forecasting. So one last thing I just wanted to share with you guys is a little bit, I'm mindful that Mr. Yudd, this is your first time going through this. Mr. Vega, your first time. For Mr. Buffington, if he's online, his first time. So I'm going to talk just briefly in a couple minutes about the process that we go through. We used to include the process discussion as part of the presentation, and I think it kind of got boring for most of the board members. They saw it every year, and so we kind of have pushed it aside. But I'll try to do a quick summary of the process that we've gone through over the last several months that brings us to this point today. So we probably, this year, we started in August, I think. Yeah, so this process used to start in September. This year, we pulled it back a little bit in August. We start off with looking at last year's 10-year CIP, and we have all that list of projects. And in August, we kick off, we have a meeting with all of the project managers who have projects in the current CIP, and we kind of set forth and say, take all your projects and we're going to reset sort of the budget and schedule and even the project priority scoring, and we want you to take a fresh look at those. And they have several weeks to do that. That all gets kind of submitted into the planning group. We compile all of that. Meanwhile, it's been reviewed by not just the project manager who's put that together, but their supervisor and even the division directors. We asked them to get engaged, and so when all of these projects get compiled, and their project sheets is what we call, not a very clever name, but it's the best we could come up with. Each project is represented by a project sheet, and on that project sheet it has general project information, who the project manager is, what the project number is, what the title of the project is. But you do see that we have a scoring system. We have 5 categories by which we use to help try to prioritize the projects so that we understand what is the most important to us, which projects are a little bit less important comparatively. Yes. There is a 5 categories, and each category is scored on a 1 to 5 scale, and we have some guidance for staff to try to get as much consistency applied so that when people look at maybe the category on sort of the implication of deferring, that is one of the categories. If this person and this person have similar conditions on what the implication of deferring is, we want them to have similar scores, like they would both maybe score it as a 3. So we have some guidance that helps staff try to interpret what each number would be. And therefore we feel like ultimately the priority scoring we have is pretty reflective of what the overall priorities are for the organization. As everything gets compiled, we start to meet as a CIP review team, and it's really a lot of the senior leadership, senior management here at Loudon Water. And we go through all of those individual priorities as a group, and we kind of truth them and we say, hey, this project is scored pretty high, and this project over here, they really seem like they're very similar projects, maybe, but it's scored much lower than this one. Let's try to get that scoring. Which one is the better scoring to represent those projects? So we have those types of discussions as sort of a quality control measure. And then when all is said and done, we ultimately end up with an updated list of projects. And again, we start from the previous year's CIP. Many projects get completed, so they drop off and they don't carry over into the new year. I think this year we probably had 50 or so, maybe new projects that came in for the first time into the 10-year window. We had identified about 50 new needs for the organization. All in all, this whole process probably requires, I mean, it takes about 80 to 100 people at Loudon Water are involved in that. So about a quarter to maybe 30% of the staff is involved in our CIP planning. And, even though we formally start this procedure in August and it kind of culminates today, we really have created a culture here, especially over the last 5 to 10 years. We kind of live the CIP annually on a month-to-month basis. We're always paying attention to how spending is going. We're always we've kind of built in, the staff is always thinking about new needs and kind of thinking about the status of their projects. So we really kind of do live the CIP all year long. But this, I wanted to share with you sort of the process that we do go through annually that led us up here to today. So the last thing to just mention is that as you look in the 10-year CIP and you see, I think there's 200 and maybe 50 projects. Not all the projects are exactly the same. Many of those projects are what we think of as a classic infrastructure project that has kind of the stages of a planning, and then it goes on into design and then goes into construction. That's probably, if I had to guess, maybe 2/3 of the projects that are in the CIP. But sometimes we have a CIP project that really just might be a line item, and it may be just tracking something like a payment that we have to make annually to DC Water. We have a separate project in the CIP to budget those payments for out years and to track the actual expenditures against those. It's a project sort of, but it doesn't fit some of the same hallmarks of a standard project. Like, we don't have to resource that with people and so forth, right? So so that's just a little bit, there's a little bit of variation of the styles of projects that are in there. But so I don't know, any questions on anything I just said?
I do have. a couple
Yeah,
questions.
go ahead, and then before I turn it over, sure.
If we're in the joint committee at, I don't know. Well,
You
forget
can
about-
participate fully.
Forget about that. I recently got some really good schooling from Sally and Brian on the operating budget. One of the things that I was wondering about was any type of calculation or formula or analysis that capital projects induced on the organization in terms of managing them or just resourcing to be able to go through the process. So that explanation of the roll up to the CIP and capital spending plan is helpful because you say you engage a lot of the workforce here to look at it. However, and I think one of you will get to this shortly, when you look ahead in the presentation, capital spending plan for 25 is 63 million greater than the year before.
Yeah.
And so I think when you get to that part, it'd be interesting to understand what rolled up to indicate to your team that those costs were going to be higher spent in the time period anticipated in the 25 spending plan.
Yeah.
Because that's really pivotal, I think.
Yeah.
And then I'm always going to go back to Sally for education because it may trigger, what is it triggering? The cost to the project, which is to do what we did in the first item, to recognize that there's a project budget and there needs to be a contingency and we're spending it for engineering design or actual contractor work or what? And so that was, thank you for the roll up. But when you get to the point about the 63 million, what led to that type of thing?
if I may, Darren, I'm going to just try to, jump into that right now. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because it actually was a point that I wanted to kind of mention without getting into the details of it. And we can get into more detailed discussion later. As we put together these forecasts, we're even trying to do our best to forecast what's going to be needed for next year. There are things that we feel more certain with. There's 200 projects with spending next year. Some of those projects we feel more certain about the likelihood of the spending, and there are other projects that we feel a little less likely on the certainty of the spending. What may cause that? Well, what you're going to see in next year in this increase in the 63 million, and I think most of it is attributed to the JLMA area. And part of that $63 million increase is that we have projects that are moving into construction in the JLMA area. So they weren't there this year. So that's going to increase the amount of spending we need to fund the construction of some of those. And when we jumped into the JLMA, because of the fact that, I mean, in part, there were developers ready to go when we were basically asked to take that area on. There was a lot of pressure being put on us to really plan the utilities and start to get them moving really, really quick. I mean, you had developers saying, can I start tomorrow, right? So we had to kind of pick and choose different strategies to how to get that infrastructure in the ground as quick as possible. And one of the things that we did, and we've done it in the past, but it was a little bit more unique here, is we partnered with the development industry. And in cases where we had a developer who said they were going to basically come in and build some infrastructure and develop some property, we kind of said, hey, while you're doing that, would you also be willing to build some of this capital infrastructure for us, maybe a water main? And you guys say you need it, you can deliver it quicker than if we try to take it on. And if we would have tried to manage all of the CIP needs, I mean, the staffing resources we would have needed and so forth for short duration didn't make sense. So we tried different strategies. And so next year, when we have developers building some of this capital infrastructure, we have to reimburse them at the end of that construction. We get into an agreement with them. We have a fair amount of that next year, but we don't know the certainty of their schedule, of whether they're going to actually meet the schedule that they say they are. We get information from them. We really work back and forth with them. We get skeptical because we always get developers always tell us that they're going to proceed at a very advanced schedule, and then it usually doesn't fold out that way. So we try to do our best with these types of projects. And then we say, well, for next year, if this is what we think, looking sort of in the crystal ball, is most likely to occur next year, we've got to ask you guys to appropriate the funds for us. But there's a good chance that we may not need it. It's going to be dependent on somebody else's schedule and their follow through. So I think when we get into, and Darren, I think when we think about the plus $63 million, and you asked that question, this was an easy one for us to be prepared for. So I appreciate that you asked, because we were like, that's going to be a simple question to answer, is that a lot of it is going to be, there are projects that are moving into a different phase. And so that's got some of the increase, which is some of the projects we're doing are moving into construction in the JLMA. And we've got to kind of plan for these reimbursements that we foresee.
And I would say thank you for all of that. That was terrific. The reimbursable is a moving target, but I would say the construction projects maybe are less of a moving target, because you would have a start date, and if it was in 25, you'd have to be ready for it. So.
And that's true, but sometimes we get a delay right at the end, and we think the project's going to bid in January, and it doesn't bid until July, and so we get
wiped out the $63 million increase. It might not happen in 25.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we've I wanted to compliment Tom's explanation a little bit. We've kind of seen that play out, here in 2024. Our original capital spending plan was 148 million, and we're on track to spend about 128 million in the reforecast. So some of that.
Some of the 20 million was money we thought we were going to need this year for reimbursements, because that's what we were being told. And we're like, nope, not coming true. But now we think it's going to be next year. So some of that money is not spent this year, but is being pushed back.
And last year at this time, some of the projects, just by name, the Village at Clear Springs, we thought that was materializing a little faster. We have more certainty this year. We have an agreement in place now. We know that's going to move into construction. So there is, to Tom's point, there is a lot of back and forth with the developers, or to your point, Mr. Yudd, with our own contractors. when we were kicking off the Milestone Reservoir project, that went to construction late last year. The schedule of values from our contractor, was pretty aggressive as to what they were going to spend in calendar year 24. I believe they've fallen a little bit short of that, but they have been pretty well on target. So there's always this ambition in these spending schedules that we have to try to balance.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a subject of this presentation, but how do you relate personnel requirements to the CIP? Is there a formal process, or how do you, or do you?
No, we do. I don't know if I will say that it's formal. When we're going through the CIP review team, and we have a couple of 3 meetings that are usually half-day meetings. Once we get through the second meeting where we've reviewed and we've discussed every project, we feel comfortable with everybody kind of understands what the project is and what we're comfortable with the priority rating. One of the things we ask every director who's in that meeting is, okay, your goal now is you understand all the projects that are in the CIP. You should now understand what your team's role is going to be in participating in every one of those projects. So we want you to come back in the next couple of weeks and confirm for us that you have the staffing resources that are needed to fully cover your obligations to meet this what we're going to propose for the CIP. And if not, then you need to help us kind of say, how much can you do and where do you recommend that we defer some projects because you don't have the labor to do it. It really is, it is Savita's group, capital programs group, who really is the one that really, they're there to just execute the CIP. That's what capital programs does, whether it's the design and construction. Most of the other groups, whether it's operations technology, whether it's the line maintenance, whether it's procurement, they do so much else during the year, and their participation in the CIP is just a small portion of their normal workload. So for those groups, we never have an issue. They always say, yeah, that's fine. It's probably going to be 10% of my staff's time to help support the CIP next year. No problem. We can accommodate that. But the capital programs group is the one that usually has to look at and says, hey, there's 90 projects being asked of us to support with our team next year. We can't do 90 projects. We don't have the bandwidth to do it. So then they'll kind of say, here's what we recommend. We recommend that we can, and this is where the priority scoring is helpful, because we can start to say, let's look at the lower priority projects that maybe you are planning on taking on, and let's see if we can defer those to other years. And then ultimately, we'll develop sort of a new cutoff line, and then we'll take the projects that didn't make the cutoff line and we'll push them back a year or 2. And part of that discussion is that okay? Maybe it's a lower priority, but the urgency is still great. Then maybe that project stays and another one gets kind of bumped out. But so that's how we do the resourcing. There isn't really a magic formula. It's not mathematical, but Rita has to feel comfortable that she has the staff available to lift what we're putting, in the CIP, that they can carry that. Yeah, yeah.
Tom,
Yeah.
Mr. Kelly has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jewel. Good morning, Tom. Great introduction. Thank you.
Good morning.
Appreciate
Thank you.
that. You mentioned this and I picked up on it when I was reading through the budget. JLMA seems to be a big driver of the additional costs. So when you have something like that, which came up as somewhat of a surprise several years ago, how do you factor something like that into your budget? I don't think that was ever anticipated in the budget, at least. And that's a pretty big outlay of costs. And what does that do to other projects that you have already in the budget that are kind of rolling along and anticipate? I'm just kind of curious how you take something like that and kind of blow up your budget and start again, and how you phase something like that so it doesn't just take everything out of whack.
Yeah, ooh, that's really loud. I think one of the key strategies that we did adopt, and I kind of touched on this before, was that when we kind of saw everything that we needed to build or needed to be built to put service into the JLMA, we realized that there was an urgency there and it was a high priority. We don't ever want to be in the kind of position where development can't occur at its kind of preferred schedule because the water and sewer aren't there. We don't want to be in that position. So these projects to get service out to the JLMA were high priority, and they were scored as such in the CIP process. This is where we kind of said, what other strategies are available to us besides we just taking on the design and construction? And this is where we really said, let's bring in other partners. And that was primarily the development community, where we said, look, there's a lot of developers that are ready to go, or at least are ready to start submitting plans to build this infrastructure, but they need water and sewer. Maybe there's a mile of water main and a mile of sewer that need to be built to connect where they're going to develop to our existing infrastructure. And where we could, we kind of said, let's talk to them about them taking that on. And so that has turned into a series of these reimbursement projects in the CIP where they're still of a high priority, but you know, for us, we kind of need to negotiate with that developer to get a fair cost for it. And then we really just need to kind of track it and then pay for it. So it doesn't really take up a lot of our personnel resources to do that. And so it was kind of a way to keep then a lot of the other projects that we had as needs, we were able to still fit those into our overall workload because we were able to shift some of that workload to partners in the development community. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, Tom, a question. You know, we're focused on the 5-year plan, and typically we focus on what's included in the 5 and 10-year plan.
Yeah.
I was just curious, are there any major projects that, you know, because of perceived financial constraints that were pushed back due to the prioritization that you could speak on? Is there anything that came up that was like, hey, it's close, but due to these other constraints or other priorities, resource constraints, that you had to defer?
You know, I'll answer that with a yes, but, because I can't think of any one particular project, but as we go through the process every year and once we get all these individual projects and we compile this schedule of spending for each and every of the 10 years, when we first get that, it goes through many iterations of revision before we get to today, because we'll look at the spending and maybe perhaps in year 3, the way everybody scheduled out their projects, there's this huge spike. Maybe it says that looks like we're going to need $230 million in year 3. And we say, well, that doesn't, we don't want that. We don't want a huge spike in our 10-year curve. We want our curve to be able to be kind of relatively as smooth as possible from a financial planning standpoint. We want the spending to be as consistently as possible. So how do we get that money out of year 3 and into year 4 and year 5? We start looking, well, where is a lot of those funds coming from? What projects are really big contributors? And then we start asking ourselves, is that really a necessary project for spending at that schedule? What if we push that project back and started in year 4 or year 5 and we shift it back? And then slowly as we start doing that, we're able to kind of sort of flatten the whole curve so that we have a smoother kind of planned spending going forward. So we go through that process every year, but I can't point to you any super large projects this year that come to my mind right now that we pushed out of the 5-year window, but it often is a compilation of a lot of smaller projects. It maybe is 5 million gets shifted here and 3 million gets shifted here and 7 here and 10 here. And you do that for 15 or 20 projects. And all of a sudden you've brought that curve down or that spending down from 230 down to 170. And now it starts to feel better. So, yeah, but if you were really interested, we could dig into it and figure out what kind of, if there were, you know, any significant projects that shifted this year. So, but off the top of my head, I'm not coming up with any. And maybe Darren will recall something. And if you do, Darren, maybe when you get to that point, you can feel free to modify that. So, everybody ready? buckled up?
I appreciate the nimbleness there of dealing with the JLMA. That kind of came out of the left field to begin with, and there's just so much complexity with all this.
Yeah.
And so thinking outside the box a little bit and going, how can we work with this? And that's really smart. That really helps with overhead and all that. And
Yeah.
so I think that's great that you guys are doing that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Darren?
Feels like we've been through it all already. So I'm going to go through some of the highlights of our major projects and the major influences on our spending plan in the 1 year, and then also look out in those 5 and 10 year plans and talk a bit about how all this kind of fits together. Tom already kind of talked about the process. This will get combined with the operating budget and presented to the board for that approval on the capital spending plan, that 1 year. So a couple of key issues or notes that we'll talk about here is just this overall plan, and Tom did a great job going through this. It really identifies the needs across our whole of Loudon Water. And we have 230, 240 projects identified for the next 10 years. As we know, every year there's a few surprises, and we'll get a few more projects we know, but that's a good picture of what's coming. We have prioritized these projects. The priorities are not cut in stone, but they give us a good guide for what's important. And we balance that with the entire organization, with our mission statement, with everything that we're trying to do here. And we did notice right away that, yes, there's a significant increase in the spending. We think that's realistic because of the kind of advanced pace of construction and reimbursement projects that are really moving ahead this next year. We also saw then, similar to the 1 year, the 5 year has increased quite a bit. And we did look for reasons for that, tried to see if there's anything we could defer. And one of those, I'll just mention, we have been thinking about dredging in the Goose Creek. Our initial estimates that we got from that, from just kind of really ballpark, were gigantic. So we've taken some time to kind of dig into it, so to speak, and figure out what is it really needed now? What could we do with that? And so some of that spending has been pushed out of the 5 year plan as we figure out more what's really the best path there. Then the final thing I'll note, not every, but the spending that we're showing here is net of any grants or other outside funding. So it's kind of a financial look at this. We do get some outside funding, reimbursements from the county, and we do have a couple grants that are out there too. So we'll focus in a little bit on the 2025 capital spending plan. There are 164 projects spread across all of our different programs or departments, you might say, totaling about $180 million. Every year in our financial tracking and in our project setups, we kind of break all of our projects down into these different categories. So we have essentially our treatment plants, our community systems, the water, wastewater, finance, admin and facilities kind of is a bit of a catch-all for the buildings like this, for the IT upgrades and so on. So we have a number of projects in every category for a lot of different amounts. And we kind of then show this in the bar graph or the column chart. And you can see that we have perhaps, like if you just look at Potomac Water Supply, relatively few projects, but fairly high spend. That's due to the quarry. And we'll kind of walk through each of these departments, each of these programs to talk a little bit more about the key projects or the focus of those different departments for next year. If you start at finance, these are projects that are pretty much fixed, very similar spending year after year. These are our payments that we make for our treatment capacity, conveyance capacity with the other wholesalers out there. This includes some of the routine developer reimbursement. We have broken out larger ones or specific ones so we can track those separately, but we're always doing some level of reimbursement for upsizing and other work with development community. And this, of course, includes our debt service too, which is relatively consistent. In the water wastewater programs, this includes some significant projects, and you'll notice most of these projects you've already seen. These are projects that are now under construction. They're well underway. They've already gone through the CIP committee, through the board, and are approved. Things like the Dulles South Water Booster Station upgrade, the Lansdowne Sewer Pump Station upgrade. Those are both well underway. When we talk about JLMA, I'll just kind of note that for me at least, the JLMA is that specific area, but it also is really kind of the whole western part of our service area, because at that same time, we gained a new transition policy area. We also are having to improve or upgrade a lot of kind of downstream infrastructure. And some of this is just related to all the other development that's going on in our central system out there. There's a lot of data centers going up out by Trap Rock, not necessarily in the JLMA, but they're all interconnected, all part of that big planning. So we have a lot of linear infrastructure, the water sewer mains, the Russell Branch Pump Station, that's one that we're building here, that's under construction. The JLMA West Pump Station, that's a reimbursement project. So we're expecting a pretty large payment next year as they wrap that project up. If you move into our community systems or administrative facilities, community systems, you'll see this coming up again and again as we move through the next few years. It's a regulatory driven project, the ammonia removal upgrades. That'll be heavy in design next year, and then in future years move into construction. On the other side, the major IT project we have going on is our S/4HANA upgrade. That should wrap next year also, but will require, again, significant spending next year. Potomac Water Supply, you've seen this project a number of times, the Milestone Reservoir. That's one of the largest individual projects we have for the next year and for the next few years. We also have some improvements out at Trap Rock to put in the new big generator. So there's some of these treatment style projects. This is obviously not every project that's going on in all of these departments, but we're trying to kind of highlight a few of the major ones. You also notice, I guess, just to say, we are continually looking at, is this best served by a developer, or are there other methods we can deliver this? So we had the ammonia, which is kind of a design build process. Milestone is the CMAR. So we have a lot of different styles of work going on. And then Broad Run, next year, they have a number of projects going on, but the big ones will be the phase 3 site work. The kind of package 1 will go out, and that'll be in construction. And then we'll continue design of all the rest of the phase 3 expansion. So those are kind of the major pieces of next year's spending. We like to take all that spending and kind of figure out, well, what are we really spending on? What phase of the project is this in? How certain are we of what's happening? You can see if you look at our overall spending, about 80% of it is kind of what I would call kind of out of our control, or kind of fixed in a sense, because it's under construction or because it's part of our financial obligations. We know that spending's coming. With stuff under construction, there's obviously some potential for delays that may not actually happen. Some of this relies on those sometimes aggressive schedules from contractors or developers. But nonetheless, this is spending we know will happen. We assume it will happen next year. This is the most conservative, best approach to financing that. The other projects, we have a lot of design planning and equipment just purchases that are built into the capital plan too. We also like to look at all the spending and kind of say, so what's driving the spending? So if you look at this actually has the kind of total budget. What's really driving the spending? If you look at our projects based on cost, about 80% of our spending is related to growth and reliability upgrades. That's still the major focus of our system. We're still a growing system. I think over the next few years, I would anticipate we get a bit more spending in some of the other categories, especially that renewal and replacement category. That's the rehab project. Most projects are actually probably in a couple categories. When we maybe replace something, we're also maybe improving the technology. We may be also adding a pump to improve capacity. So it's a little bit of a blended approach on all of our projects, but this is generally where most of the spending is assigned. We also look at the drivers and in terms of just the number of projects. And that kind of speaks a little bit more to our resourcing needs. Because the more projects we have, we need more project managers, we need more people involved. And there you can see that renewal and replacement is getting to be a much bigger portion of the pie. But it's still pretty much spread through a number of different drivers. And some of those are those joint projects we do with the county. We're also always trying to improve or just make sure that our technology is up to date for all of our assets. Some of them are regulatory driven or compliance driven, but still a lot of it's also growth.
Darren, a quick
Yep.
question. Do you have any sense for how much we might need to grow our head count over the next 10 years, 5 years? Do you mean like a ballpark?
I will
If you
punt
don't,
on that
it's
one.
okay.
I'm not sure. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else has an idea there.
You have a ballpark, Brian? Any sense? If you don't, that's okay.
I would say on average, we've been adding 5 to 8 staff a year. I'd say a lot of that tends to be more of your blue collar maintenance workers. We have added some inspectors based on the JLMA, as well as we're going to need some full-time inspectors for Broad Run. Land development, I think we added an extra person this year because we're seeing a lot of projects. But I think as we get closer towards completion of the Broad Run Phase 3 expansion, which is obviously quite a ways off, we're going to have to add some headcount to accommodate for that. But I don't think over the next few years, we're going to see a substantial increase in staff.
Good.
Yeah.
That's great.
We've done some things internally to help with the efficiencies as well. So like we have sort of a smaller capital projects team embedded within the wastewater operations team that's helping head up really all things Broad Run. And, you know, there has been a bit of additional headcount to facilitate that over the last couple of years, but we've seen it's really helped strike the right balance internally that's really just boosted overall efficiency. So we've been doing some things along those lines as well to help complement the needs for headcount.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
I think that actually goes back to even some of the conversation that I was having in response to the question that was asked before about we're trying to level that forecast as best as we can and keep sort of that smooth forecast, because that also affects how many projects we think we're going to, and therefore, you know, can we continue to just progress with similar size staffing versus if we saw a big spike in 4 years, boy, that would indicate most likely that you're going to be taking on a lot more. And then do you really want to hire people for 4-year periods? Now, generally speaking, if we can kind of work and strive to keep that smoothed out, that helps us manage sort of our staffing needs as well.
No, that's great. Yeah. It's 1.7 billion over the next 10 years. 240 projects at the moment that we know of. That's a lot of work. But if we've got the people for it, more or less, great. That's great.
I know this is probably buried in some of the projects, but I looked through the projects, I didn't see anything specifically aimed at security, whether it's physical security or you know, defense against hacking, that kind of thing. Where do we take that into account?
There are some projects actually in the administrative section that are towards security, and I don't remember.
guess I missed it.
Yeah, I can't think of which project numbers they actually are, but there's probably 2 or 3 in there that have to do with improvements to existing facilities, whether it's physical security or even electronic security and so forth like that. So they are in there, and I can help you find them later on if you're interested in looking for them.
No, that's okay.
I would just say, and Alton can correct me if I'm wrong, but security is also embedded in the projects that you're seeing as part of their cost, like their security embedded in the Broad Run expansion project. That's just not a separate project, but security for all of these facilities are part of that payment. Yes.
And I believe there's an element of this that's also embedded in the operating budget as well, those ongoing improvements.
That's questions. Do you mind backing up to this slide? I don't have a number on it, but
Okay, I actually haven't gotten there yet.
okay.
Yeah, I cut them off, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Then mine are out of order because,
Okay.
keep going.
Okay. So this was kind of a good stopping point, actually, because this is kind of what we're showing for that 2025 capital spending plan. And this is really where we have the most certainty, where we've done the most review to make sure we can handle the number of projects and so on. And then we kind of transfer and start looking out more toward the future, toward that 5-year plan, which is also critical for finance. It relates to our rates, relates to our borrowing schedules and so on. And then also the 10-year plan, which is a bit more visionary, but looks really at what's coming and helps us plan for the future.
Darren, if I could just chime in just for a moment, because we were just wrapping up that first year and again, the total ask was 180.
182 or 190.
182 million. I have there's one more item after we get through the CIP, which is the standard monthly sort of CIP summary of our spending that I was share with you guys. And I'm just going to jump into that because I was reviewing that and we are right now at 95% of actual spending compared to the mid-year reforecast. But when I go back and look at the original forecast for this year, which again was like the 147 million, we're actually tracking at 90% of that 147. So we're 95% compared to the mid-year reforecast, which as Alton mentioned was lowered to about 127 million. So we actually are seeing good spending this year. And I think 90% is probably as a goal, that's probably where we like to be. We don't want to be so close that we have to worry about needing to come back and get more approved from the board as the year goes along. So I think maybe that leads a little bit towards our performance is doing really well this year. And maybe to the discussion they had with Mr. Yutt earlier about, yeah, there's an increase in the amount that's being requested for next year, but we kind of got a good track record right now, kind of heading out of the spending that we forecasted for this year. We're actually hitting it pretty doggone well at 90% right now. So, and we'll see where we end up at the end of the year, but I expect we'll end up probably very close to a 90% number. So, you know, if that's any indication of where we're going to be next year, that's a good sign too.
Great.
Thank you.
No problem. So we'll move into the kind of 5-year and 10-year look. So this is the same kind of program-based look, and you can see roughly $200 million in spending every year for the next 5 years. It goes up and down a little. We do come back and look at this every year. Every year we're readjusting this. The 2025 capital spending plan, most of those projects that I showed are already projects that are underway in construction. They've been through the board, they've been through the process. This will start talking or touching on some projects that perhaps are a little less known or a little bit less, haven't been seen by the board already. So you can see that there's major spending in Broad Run. That's mostly the expansion. The Potomac water supply, that's mostly the quarry. And we'll kind of walk through all of these and again, highlight some of those key projects. But we also looked at this right away and we've kind of said, okay, that first 5 years, how does that compare to what we thought we were looking at last year? Because we saw that 1-year increase. So now we're kind of looking at, well, what's the 5-year increase? What's changed? And it's a significant increase. We noticed that right away, just like you probably did. We also tried to look at kind of the year over year, the same years, what's going on there. And I guess there's a lot of different reasons for every single project, but overall, there's a lot of projects that have moved kind of into construction, or we have a much better schedule and better cost certainty on a lot of different projects, including some major projects like Broad Run, like a lot of the JLMA type projects. For many years, those projects were a little bit speculative because they're development based. And we had to make sure that they were actually going to move forward. Developers sometimes pull back at the last minute if interest rates change or something else happens. But they're definitely moving forward. And so some of that has become much more cost certain, and we've pulled that into that 5-year plan. The other thing we do with this is, especially when we see an increase like this, is we'll turn to finance and say, is this okay? Can we do this as a system? Well, we're looking at the resourcing, the staffing. It's also, we know it's a monetary issue, it's a budget issue. So I'm going to let Sally talk just for a sec about them looking at it.
So we did preliminarily roll it into the 5-year plan. And so right now it is still looking that we will need borrowing in 2026. Of course, the size and timing of that will vary based on actual spending that comes in. We do roll in the assumptions that we were talking about, Tom was talking about there. So the assumptions are 90% for the 2025 plan. And then it drops 85 to 80 because the outer years are less certain. So those are assumptions I'm using today in the plan. So in early next year, we'll consult with Davenport, and then we will come back to the Finance Committee in the first quarter of 2025 with the revised 5-year plan for endorsement.
Thanks. So with that, then we kind of move on and continue to scroll through all the different projects, and I'll go through a few of the highlights or the major spending significant projects in the next 5-year plan. And these are grouped a little bit differently, but if you look kind of at the treatment or supply side of our projects, that includes a lot of expansion work at Broad Run. That's the design that's probably in the next 5 years will hit the package 1 and 2 construction projects. The building expansion is kind of somewhere in that phase 3 design also. And then we also have, of course, the Milestone Reservoir that should complete in that 5-year window. And then we're looking also at a trap expansion. If we move to kind of the water wastewater programs and we look at specifically that JLMA area and the downstream infrastructure, there's a lot of linear facilities that need to get installed. Some of these will be installed by us. Some of them will be developer reimbursements. I think a lot of that will be developer reimbursement. And then we also have a number of sewer pumping stations. Some of these are somewhat kind of downstream of the JLMA, but nonetheless influenced in their sizing. So we've grouped them here. Russell Branch and Goose Creek are underway projects that we are building as Loudon Water. The JLMA West pump station is a reimbursement project. North Lower Sickland is kind of upcoming. It still would be more design at this point, but that's probably something we will take on. And then if you look more broadly at just kind of repair replacement type program and also some regulatory upgrades that are required, in the next few years, we'll have a lot of spending related to the ammonia removal upgrades at all of our community wastewater plants. We also have a number of water and sewer mains that we'll be looking at to rehab or replace just as our system ages, so we can get ahead of that and not have everything fail all at once. And then there's a number of other projects mixed into those different categories. We'll also highlight real quick the partnership projects that we have with the county. So this is part of the county-funded water and wastewater program. You'll hear a lot about these, the Paonian Springs and Waterford area. These are basically just the design funds that we've budgeted for because the county hasn't actually formally budgeted anything for construction yet. We also are not budgeting anything for construction. Eventually, the spending here will be significantly more. Those are multi-million-dollar projects. But at this point, that's what we have. We also have the Broad Run Farms water mains and Luckett's that are also county-funded programs. So this is part of that kind of reimbursement type funding that comes through. And then kind of finally, in a sense, the financial program, this is very consistent spending year over year. It's basically our debt service. It's our wholesale purchase of treatment and capacity in the other systems. And then it also includes kind of the standard reimbursements that we do with developers as we work through all parts of our system. And that could be water, sewer, or reclaimed. So then we like to take all of this and throw this into the 10-year plan and kind of look at that long-range forecast. Again, all of these are kind of grouped by that color coding that we use. So if you look across the bottom, all the gray, that's relatively consistent spending. That's our financial obligations. Water and wastewater kind of sit on top of that. There's a lot coming up in the next 5 years. A lot of that we think is due to that expansion of our service area. And then toward the top there, especially in the outer years, you can see a lot of spending on the broad run expansion. Those costs continue to be refined as we move through design, as we move through actual construction and seeing what's out there. So
Darren, I'll just mention,
Yep.
I really like this graph, and I think it's a great way to just visually kind of check if things are making sense. I mean, you can see the top orangish brown color is broad run, right? And you can see how in years here, like 3 through 8, it really becomes a dominant, expense. You can kind of, the next layer down, that dark blue, you see heavy spending in 25, 26, and 27, and then it's really starting to taper off, and that's Milestone Reservoir. So that all, it's kind of a quick way, like if you see a big spike in the colors, does it intuitively match what we know that we have going on? And if you get down a little lower into the blue, that's the second one from the bottom, and the bright green above it, that's the water wastewater. And you can see that it gets pretty heavy through the first 5 years, and a lot of that is the JLMA projects. There's always some water main and sewer projects that we have going on, but the fact that they've become more dominant in those years. And so it's a really good, quick visual way for us to actually just look at, does it seem to be making sense? So it's one of the quick tools that we use. I call it a cigarette diagram. I don't know why, because it looks like, I don't know, maybe the top of Broad Run is the color of a filter used to be on a Marlboro cigarettes. I don't know, but it looks like a cigarette.
I wanted to come back and connect to the question Mr. Moody had earlier as well, because I think this does a good job of illustrating it. And that is, you asked about the deferral of projects. We also have sought to design some of these larger programs to, in a sense, help spread out the work. I think Broad Run is a great example. We've broken that into the 4 packages that extend not only in this 10-year window, but package 4 will carry on beyond this current 10-year picture. And based on the individual processes within the plant and the needs on that basis, we've been able to spread this project out to help with what you were asking about earlier, Mr. Moody.
Yeah, and I think one thing, that 218 in 2027, I bet you when we bring forward this next year, and that's year 2, we'll probably try to see if we can reduce that 218 to get something that's kind of closer to the 200 level. Now, again, it may be that projects are kind of slowing down, and we might actually start to get like a little bit of a snowplow effect. And when we go through the CIP process, the first look at this chart might show that 2027 has gone from 218 to 235. And then we'll work to say, boy, that seems really, really difficult. Are there projects that we can shift out and start deferring so that we don't have so much of a financial impact, as well as that resource impact also is something that we have to take into consideration. So.
Notice in all of the slides, you say net of outside funding. I assume that's not very great.
No. So actually, in the next slide, this one is one of the few slides that is not net of outside funding. So you can see there's a small increase in the totals there. Instead of 180, it's 2, it's now 190, and so on. But most of that outside funding is related to the county programs. There's a little bit of other grants that we have related to the quarry. But you'll see it on the final slide, what that is. But we also kind of look here at, well, how did this change year over year? Again, we see quite a bit of a change in those years like 3, 4, 5. And that's a lot having to do with the cost certainty and the scheduling that we're starting to see out of the expansion of our system. So finally, if you want to look at just kind of highlight, well, what actually is that outside funding? This is kind of a real simple way to look at it. So the 2025 capital spending plan, the totals 190 million. We will get about 8 million in outside funding, so the net is 182. Over the 10 years, right now, we're anticipating about 27 million in outside funding. Should Paonian or so on actually move into construction, those numbers are going to change. So that's one, I guess, advantage or one nice thing by coming back every year. We do update, we do revisit all these costs, and I really got to shout out to all the staff that puts together all of our project sheets. It's a huge process for the organization, and I get to come here and present it with Tom and everyone, but it's really the work of a lot of people behind the scenes, and thank you to them.
Are you ready for questions? So I would say to all the folks that the organization serves, they should feel very confident in the planning that you all do. That is extremely thorough to understand the look out 10 years to what the system needs. If you could go back to this slide for a second, because I also wanted to raise, and I think it is appropriate because of this being a joint committee and it being sort of a work session type format to kind of put this stuff on the table. If you look at those categories, they are helping us as the board of directors envision, this slide is 5 years out, but ultimately envision what does the system look like in 2034. And so we are not only estimating the project work that needs to occur, but the dollars and cents that are needed to pay for it. So it's overwhelmingly excellent. However, for me, I think I also need to evaluate and address areas where there are risks. And I think to me, the Potomac water supply is an area of risk for the region, for our community, for our customers, for the organization, because we've seen drought-induced conditions. We are spending money because we are hoping to implement a plan for water supply and storage, and that's a great thing. Is it enough? In the community system area, we have a view that is showing us the cost of where Loudon Water participates. And it's a finite, identifiable, quantifiable figure, but the need in that area is far greater than that green line, that dark green line. We have one of the projects that was listed up there had discussion last night in front of the Board of Supervisors where there were community concerns because they want the project to occur, but those whose properties are nearby and adjacent to where the community wells might be are really concerned about the impact to them and the potential aspect that they might not be served. At the same time, in the rural area, we have the towns that are operating their systems, and we have a report every month here about constrained groundwater resources. And so if you talk about risk, it might be out of the central service area, but it's huge in that green line. If you talk about risk in the central service area, in the county in general, and to the region, it's in that, I don't know, is that blue or purple or something up there? This one. So, long story short, do we need to invest more? Do we spend a percentage of the Potomac water supply on conservation issues where you're telling people you're going to have to deal with this in the future? There may be constrained supplies regionally, locally. That is just about what we're doing for the cost for the projects that we have. But is it enough? Because in 2034, are we still going to be able to provide the services given potential constraints in natural resources? And so I see risk there in a couple categories. But I do see a wonderful, thoughtful process that the staff has undertaken to keep this system moving forward and invest where we need to invest. But I think we also need at some point to have a discussion about risk and the amount of commitment we make to bridge that somehow if needed. And those are my comments. Thank you.
I think those are good comments, but considering the way this staff reacted to the JLMA, which came totally out of the blue, I have confidence that they would be able to accommodate what you're saying. And I think those are good comments, but I think the staff is flexible enough to take care of that.
I agree. I agree. And I don't think there's any debate in there.
Yeah, no.
When JLMA arrived in 2019, this organization here went immediately into the planning necessary to figure out how to provide those services with some estimate of costs along the way. But I'm talking about, I think I'm talking about not a policy change, but a resource constraint that may be upon us. And are we planning for that? And so that is my view of how I will react to our capital spending plan and our capital improvement planning over the next 10 years. Think about it. Some of us won't be here in 2030. I mean, I don't think I'll be here as a board member. Maybe I'll still be walking on Earth in 2034. But I really want the resource protection that goes way back. And Mr. Peterson can speak to some of the long-range planning on water supply protection. We're so blessed that we have retiring quarries in the area. Other jurisdictions don't. But are we doing enough? Is there enough investment? With that investment, is there enough investment in education on conservation? I don't think so. That's my perception. Do I feel like the staff could handle it? Absolutely.
I think point well taken. We've been laser focused on what's in front of us for quite some time. And I think you bring a fresh set of eyes to, stepping back and kind of resetting our vision.
Mr. Allen has a question.
Thank you, Jewel. Just to dovetail off of what Mr. Yudd is talking about, I think, first of all, I appreciate this presentation. I always look forward to it every year because it's exciting to see all the projects and all the things that we're doing. And while we're sitting here, I went back and I looked at our 2019 10-year plan, capital improvement plan. And I looked at some earlier years too. And we do a great job at forecasting the first 5 years of our plan. But if you go back and look at the 2019 plan, our capital improvement budget for 2025 was 56 million. And you look at it now, it's almost 200 million. So I think we don't do a very good job at that 5 to 10 year period. And it's understandable why, because it's hard to anticipate out 5 to 10 years. But inevitably, things happen and our costs go up. So like Mr. Yudd said, I think we get caught in the immediate 5 years and we're not thinking enough about what possibly could happen in the next 5. So I don't know how we get there. I don't know what we do to try to get a more accurate forecast at the second 5 years. But if you go back and look at the reports, we're way off on these numbers. And it's things like the JMLA which come up that we don't anticipate. But, maybe in 5 years, if there's water restrictions or conservation doesn't work, we have to go out west. And then we have a giant expansion. So I don't know how we anticipate those things, but it would be nice to try to brainstorm where potential expenses could come from in those outline years. So everything we're doing is great. I just wish we could get a little better at that. And maybe we can't, but maybe we need to be more cognizant of that. But it's more of a comment than a question. But thank you.
I wanted to speak to something and that I think Mr. Yudd brought up in terms, and it gets to, it's an example of some of the things we're thinking about, have been planning for, that don't show up in here, and it's being prepared. And I think this might sort of help with a little bit of what was brought up, and that is in terms of the Potomac Water Supply Program. And I think, Mr. Yed, you kind of asked, like, is it enough? And certainly there's always more we can do, but a couple things. I mean, we've got the quarry project. We also have prepared ourselves where we have the Goose Creek Reservoir and Beaver Dam. And currently they are an additional emergency backup. You recall, we've connected that to our system, so that's addition. And when we had the quarry online, we still have that as another backup supply. The other thing goes back 10 years ago. We have additional agreements that are sort of continued MOUs in place with Luck Stone on additional quarries in the future. And we've specifically set those up so that we have identified and laid out potential additional quarries, some range of timing where those are available. We just haven't gone as far as specifically setting up the way that the business arrangement of how all the financial arrangements are going to be in place. However, we have examples. If the town of Leesburg or the region is looking for additional solutions and comes and is really interested in the kind of resiliency and redundancy we're creating with these, particularly with these quarries, these are going to be available and ready to go. And we've done the work to prepare it there, but you don't see big expenses because we're not planning for that ourselves. It would be additional partners, regional partners coming in. But we've set that up that we're prepared for that. So I think it kind of helps in terms of we're thinking of these things. We've prepared for some of this. It's just you don't see it even in a 10-year in terms of our expense. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
It does help, Mark, and I think that foundation work is critical.
Yeah.
I think maybe some of it needs to show up in the 10 years. Maybe it's where Terry is speaking to the second 5 years, but
right.
Thank you.
And I wanted to point out sort of whole separate thing, but we have this Water Resources Committee that we started up for the board a few years ago. And if you're able, next month, we're going to start into some topic areas. Darren had reminded me, we're going to start to look at some, the operational side, some of the planning work that we're doing that it won't fully address your comments, but I think it's a start. And, I love the momentum with that committee. And I think we're going to be able to come back with, taking some of these suggestions in stride and bringing you guys back some great information.
The committee meeting is coming up soon.
It's coming up December 3rd.
Mr. Allen, I want to piggyback on your comment. I like the fact that we're looking 5 to 10 years out. I like the fact that we even have our 100-year plan, as impossible as that is. But to some extent, all these things are unknowable, and we know that they're unknowable. But having a number there or a project, or at least even identifying some of these potential things, is better than just not doing it. But there's just so many variables that are outside of our control with costs and timing and so forth. From my perspective, it's really unknowable. And yet, forecasting and planning purposes, it's helpful to put something. Anything's better than nothing, but it's truly unknowable. And I think, at least in my mind, I would just like to, if I had to critique ourselves, I would want to critique ourselves more on the basis of identifying the potential projects or risks or areas, as opposed to the dollar amounts, because the dollar amounts are just so variable with so many things. I would rather critique our success or accuracy just on are we at least identifying these major buckets, and if we're missing major things, like, then I would go, okay, well, we need to do better there. Let's at least identify the potential items. But the dollar figures, from my perspective, are just too difficult to try to peg in any number of these years. But I think like what Charles is talking about, like with Western Loudon, when does some big need happen out there? Who knows? We at least know that it's a thing. Maybe it's not for another 15 years. People have been talking about this for 30 years. Who knows when it's going to hit? We don't know. We just know it's a thing and it's on our radar. And I think that's the important thing. And same with some of these other issues. They just need to be on the radar. We don't know when they're going to come. We have no idea how much money they're going to cost. As long as they're on the radar. And I think we have such a great process that when they become real, whenever that is, like JLMA, that became real. Well, we had a process to kick off and we go, well, we know what we're going to do once that phone call comes and says, oh man, Percival's out of water or whatever the thing is. We have good processes in place. And so I feel comfortable at least with the processes we have.
And it's that series of checks and balances. It's this to me, it's the fundamentals of planning here. Our growth pays for growth structure, but then this process coupled with the 5-year plan update every year, coupled with the rate setting process the rate study process that we're going through right now. These things happening in those continuous cycles, I think is fundamental.
Mr. Kelly has a question.
Thanks, Jewel. A comment and a couple of questions. Y'all raise a good point about risk and so forth. But in my almost 12 years on the board, I've always been delighted by how much thought goes into this by the staff. I mean, go back and I think when Dale was here and even well before my time, the land for the intake on the Potomac water supply, the land along the Greenway, that was secured years ago before that was just a concept. The Milestone Reservoir, the agreements with Luckstone, the easements we're getting from Nova Parks for the trade for the sending on the Reservoir Park. I mean, all these were well ahead of their times and well thought out. So I think it would be worthwhile to maybe have a brainstorming session to talk about additional risk. One other risk was, I remember that we had a presentation, or had more than one presentation, about contaminants on the Potomac River, what happens. And, the fact that we have the Milestone Reservoir, we have secured Beaver Dam Reservoir and Goose Creek Reservoir. I mean, all of that kind of, was discussed at one time and planned. So I think it might be helpful to have another session like that to kind of look out and see where are we at risk and what do we do about it so we're never caught off guard. 2 questions. Does any of the budget include either the anticipated or proposed 7% rate increase or the reimbursement for the electric lines that are coming from VDOT, or I'm sorry, from the Potomac Electric Company?
Mr. Kelly, you would see that as part of your 5-year plan of finance in the spring. That does include the reimbursement for the right-of-way that we granted. And that does include the additional increase in rates and availability charges. And that is part of the reason why when we plugged the increase in spending that you saw here today into the 5-year plan, that there wasn't a need to borrow money sooner than was projected.
Okay. Thanks, Brian.
Question. Do any of these forecasts include a cost escalation assumption? Like a projected CPI assumption, or is it today's dollars?
I think the way we do the forecasting, we do it in today's dollars, but when we hand it over to finance, they do sort of the cost escalation in the analysis there. So we try to just keep everything kind of in just today's dollars. Yeah, makes it a little bit simpler from a planning perspective. Yeah.
I actually wanted to just make one other quick comment that I think you'd be interested in. In the utility business across the country, there are a couple of what are called these forums that have been developed, and one of them, most recent, there was just the first meeting of it just last year, is a CIP forum, and Tom Lipinski is one of 5 or 6 utility, employees across representing different utilities across the country. That is one of the sort of founding executive committee members of that. And I got to go out to Denver with him last spring, I guess it was, or earlier this year for the first annual kind of meeting. It was utilities from across the country. And I would just say, I mean, because, Tom and others have had some papers and gone to some conferences, and I think Loud and Water's really developed a reputation, across the country, but also at this forum, I mean, where it was a lot of discussion about different aspects of CIP planning and how do you develop this program. And with a couple of presentations there were a lot of questions about how we've gotten to where we have. And it's, hats off to Tom and Darren and just so many people here, but really have kind of become an envy of the utilities across the country. And there are a handful of others who are doing it well, but there were a lot of questions about how we've gotten, and it's been a long process, a lot of years of becoming a mindset. And I think everything they've shared with how this has become that mindset across the entire organization is, you're really seeing that. But I just thought, you'd be interested to hear that, kind of feedback from other utilities.
Is it possible to have that meeting here?
Actually, we're in the process of planning. I think it was March of this past year that we went to Denver. So the next one is in March, and it's going to be hosted by DC Water. So it is going to be, relatively close by, but it is by secret invite only. So
I hope they don't do it at the treatment plant.
it may be that we Loud and Water put our name in the hat to be one of the hosts in the coming years. But it was really an honor to be part of the founding member and being on the planning group. And what we strived as the planning group is we tried to put out invites to the different utilities that we think are really kind of leaders and progressive in how they do their CIP planning and so forth. And we probably, I don't know, I think we had maybe 50 or 60 people at last year's first meeting, and it probably represented 25 to 35 different utilities across the country, and expect probably a similar size this year, but spread out from everywhere. There were we were in Denver, so there were a lot of folks from California. There are a lot of folks from the Pacific Northwest. Really the Pacific, sort of the New England area wasn't heavily represented last year, but we're kind of trying to cast our net a little bigger this year to see if we can get some more folks in. But it really was good. It's a 2.5 day get together, and really was good. And it really was just set up to share some presentations, but really just make connections and allow you to find others within the industry who are dealing with some of the same challenges that you are if you're in the capital planning, and give you resources to reach out to. And that's really what it effectively has done. So, yeah.
Great idea.
Yeah, it really is.
Is there anything else? Somebody want to make a motion, or?
That the committee endorse the 2005 capital spending plan as presented and forward to the board.
I assume we'll put that on the consent. All in favor? Let's say that again.
I'm sorry, Mr. Sultan, I believe the finance committee put the operating budget on action. And so if we combine these,
Oh,
which we
okay.
normally do, it'd probably be best to do on action.
That's right. Yeah,
All
we
in
did,
favor?
Brian.
All in favor? Anybody against? Motion passes. I don't think we have to do the capital spending report.
I was going to say, I kind of jumped ahead on it a little bit, but yeah, if there's any questions on it, but we're at 95% of the reforecast and really about 90% of the original forecast. So.
Right, we have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor? I have a question.
Thanks, everyone.
There's one, this is a minor